February 24, 1991, a million Iraqi soldiers crouch inside fortified bunkers, their eyes fixed toward the sea. For weeks they have been told the same thing over and over, that the American Marines are coming, that the main invasion will come from the water, that Kuwait's beaches will be the battlefield where everything begins. Saddam Hussein is convinced, his generals are convinced, even the world's intelligence analysts are convinced. But 300 miles to the west, across a vast stretch of featureless desert, no satellite is paying attention to that area, but something very different is happening. 300,000 coalition troops are moving in total silence, no headlights, no radio chatter, just the low mechanical hum of engines cutting through cold desert air. Entire armored columns advance in darkness, guided by early GPS systems and carefully planned coordinates. Within 4 days, the world's fourth largest army will begin to collapse. 60% of its armored forces will be gone. Entire divisions will simply disappear from the battlefield map, and the man orchestrating what is about to happen will earn a name that history will never forget: Storming Norman. This is the story of the Gulf War. In the summer of 1990, Iraq was already under immense pressure. The country had emerged from an exhausting 8-year war with Iran, leaving it with massive debt, estimated at around $80 billion. The economy was fragile, the military was oversized, and Saddam Hussein was searching for leverage. To the south lay Kuwait, a small, wealthy nation sitting on enormous oil reserves, smaller than New Jersey, yet producing vast amounts of oil that Iraq believed it had a claim to. Saddam publicly accused Kuwait of stealing oil through slant drilling into the Rumaila oil field. He also demanded debt relief, arguing that Iraq had defended the Arab world during the war with Iran. It should not be burdened with repayment. Behind the political language, however, the objective was simple: control more oil, gain economic power, and rewrite regional borders. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces crossed into Kuwait. Within 48 hours, Kuwait ceased to exist as an independent state. A new geopolitical crisis had begun, and almost immediately, 3 massive consequences emerged. First, Iraq now controlled a significant share of global oil reserves, enough to influence global prices. Second, Iraqi forces were positioned dangerously close to Saudi Arabia, threatening the world's key energy ally. And third, a dangerous precedent had been set. A regional power had invaded and absorbed a sovereign state almost overnight. Most analysts did not see it coming. In fact, many intelligence agencies and diplomats believed Saddam was simply posturing, applying pressure, not preparing for invasion. As General Norman Schwarzkopf would later recall, even experienced Arabists were confident that an Arab state would not invade another Arab state, but they were completely wrong. For the United States, this was the first major strategic crisis of the post-Cold War world. Vietnam still haunted military thinking, and Lebanon still shaped political hesitation. The question was whether America would intervene, and if it did, how. Into this moment stepped General Norman Schwarzkopf, known to his troops simply as the Bear. He was not a conventional commander, a veteran of touring Vietnam, decorated with multiple awards for bravery. He understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Perception often matters more than firepower. But what made him particularly dangerous was his psychological understanding of his enemy. He studied Saddam Hussein not just as a military leader, but as a personality. A man shaped by force, intimidation, and absolute control, but also a man who often misread external reality. When Schwarzkopf arrived in Saudi Arabia in the summer of 1990, he was effectively handed command of the largest coalition force assembled since World War II, yet the battlefield reality was unfavorable. Iraqi forces were deeply entrenched in Kuwait, heavily armored, and well prepared for a defensive war. Coalition forces were still building up. In simple numerical terms, the defenders held advantages in both tanks and fortified positions. Schwarzkopf later explained that a direct assault on such positions normally requires a 5-to-1 advantage for the attacker. They did not have that. So instead of forcing a frontal attack, he designed something far more sophisticated: The plan relied on four pillars. First, deception, convincing the enemy that the main attack would come from the south, along the coast, where an amphibious landing was staged and heavily publicized. Second, technological superiority meant using GPS navigation, precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and real-time reconnaissance to coordinate movements that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Third, speed meant maneuvering faster than the enemy could react, before they could reorganize or reposition. And fourth, psychological warfare meant breaking morale and command confidence before decisive ground contact even occurred. On January 17, 1991, the air war began. For 40 consecutive days, coalition aircraft conducted sustained bombing. One of the most sustained campaigns in modern history. Command centers were struck with precision. Communication networks were destroyed, radar systems were blinded, and supply routes were systematically dismantled. Among the most significant breakthroughs were stealth operations by F-117 aircraft. They penetrated heavily defended airspace undetected, striking critical command infrastructure. Cruise missiles launched from naval vessels struck targets deep inside Iraq with unprecedented accuracy. But while the air war was unfolding, something else was happening quietly in the background. A deception operation on a massive scale. Schwarzkopf invited media coverage of amphibious training exercises in the Gulf of Oman. Thousands of Marines were filmed rehearsing beach landings, and global news outlets reported extensively on the imminent coastal invasion. Iraqi forces reacted exactly as intended. They reinforced coastal defenses, mined beaches, and positioned artillery to repel an invasion that would never come. Meanwhile, the real maneuver was already underway. 2 weeks before the ground assault, specialized electronic warfare and deception units, numbering only a few hundred personnel, they created the illusion of a force hundreds of times larger. Fake radio transmissions filled the airwaves, and inflatable tanks produced false heat signatures. Engine noise simulators and staged convoy patterns reinforced the illusion of mass troop concentration. In some areas, Iraqi intelligence believed they were observing entire coalition divisions forming along the front. They were watching a mirage. At the same time, in absolute silence, over 300,000 coalition troops began a massive westward movement, traveling hundreds of miles through open desert terrain. This was the maneuver that would later be called the left hook. And Saddam Hussein, for his part, remained confident. He reportedly dismissed coalition forces as technologically advanced but lacking real combat toughness. In his view, they were technicians, not warriors. That assumption would prove fatal, because for the first time in history, warfare had become fully digitized in real time. GPS allowed precise navigation across featureless terrain, and night vision turned darkness into operational advantage. Command coordination was no longer dependent on line of sight or traditional maps. Moving tens of thousands of vehicles across open desert, converging at precise coordinates hundreds of miles apart, was no longer theoretical. It was happening. One soldier later described crossing into Iraq as entering a world without reference points. No roads, no landmarks, just uniform sand in every direction. Yet with absolute certainty about direction and destination thanks to GPS guidance systems. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. While Iraqi forces remained oriented toward the south, expecting a coastal assault that would never arrive, coalition armored corps struck from the west and rapidly turned north. The 18th Airborne Corps moved deep into Iraqi territory, disrupting supply lines and severing operational depth. The 101st Airborne Division executed one of the largest helicopter-borne maneuvers in military history, seizing key terrain along Highway 8 and cutting escape routes along the Euphrates corridor. Simultaneously, the 7th Corps, the primary armored striking force, swung eastward in a massive encirclement maneuver, designed to engage and destroy the Republican Guard. This movement bypassed frontline Iraqi positions entirely. Entire enemy divisions were left behind, isolated, and rendered irrelevant as coalition forces moved past them at operational speed. Among the most significant armored engagements were the battle at 73 Easting and Medina Ridge. where coalition forces, leveraging thermal imaging and superior night fighting capability, engaged Iraqi armored units with devastating effectiveness. In these battles, Iraqi armored formations were systematically destroyed under conditions where they often could not identify the attacking forces. The result was not just defeat, it was systemic collapse. Inside Iraq's command structure, communication began to fail, and units lost contact with headquarters. Orders stopped arriving, and coordination disintegrated. In many cases, Iraqi soldiers simply abandoned positions or surrendered when contact with organized command became impossible. At the same time, coalition air and naval forces continued precision strikes against remaining command infrastructure. Stealth aircraft and cruise missiles eliminated what was left of operational control nodes. The Iraqi military machine did not just lose battles, it lost coherence. One often overlooked factor was the environment itself. A massive sandstorm known as a shamal swept across parts of the theater during the campaign, reducing visibility and forcing units to rely even more heavily on GPS and thermal imaging. Behind the front lines, coalition logistics convoys stretched for hundreds of miles, delivering fuel and ammunition at a scale comparable to entire national supply chains. Iraqi elite formations like the Republican Guards Tawakalna Division attempted to reposition, but were repeatedly outmaneuvered and struck from multiple axes. The entire operation was conducted under the framework of UN Security Council Resolution 678, which authorized force to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait. By the time ground forces converged, the outcome was already effectively decided. The war on the ground lasted approximately 100 hours. In that short time, coalition forces advanced more than 200 miles, encircling major Iraqi formations and dismantling organized resistance. Coalition casualties were relatively low, with 148 American combat deaths reported, while Iraqi losses were significantly higher, with estimates reaching tens of thousands alongside massive equipment destruction. Entire armored divisions were effectively removed from operational existence. Some Iraqi units reportedly surrendered to journalists because coalition troops were not physically present nearby to surrender to. Others simply abandoned vehicles and walked away into the desert. The scale of collapse was unprecedented in modern mechanized warfare. After 4 days of ground combat, a ceasefire was declared on February 28, 1991. Kuwait was liberated. Coalition forces stopped short of advancing into Baghdad. The decision was strategic. The coalition mandate was limited to liberation of Kuwait. Expanding the war risked breaking international unity. Several allied nations had no political authorization for regime change. Continuing the offensive would likely have fractured the coalition entirely. In later years, Schwarzkopf would argue that pushing further would have created a long-term occupation scenario with unpredictable consequences, a prediction that would later gain historical weight. What remained clear, however, was that the Gulf War had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. It demonstrated that modern conflict was no longer determined solely by numbers, armor, or territory. It was determined by information, speed, coordination, and perception. Saddam Hussein had prepared for a war of attrition shaped by Vietnam-era assumptions. Instead, he faced a war of systems, and systems do not need to outnumber you to defeat you. They only need to see you more clearly than you see them. So the final question remains: when a million-man army is defeated by a force that appears smaller, faster, and almost invisible in movement, who truly held the advantage, the side that counted its weapons, or the side that understood the battlefield itself had already changed?